I'm Sinead Laverty. I'm a client director here at LHH. I'm also our gender forum lead for the Adecco group, so from an ERG perspective. I have myself been on a Women in Leadership program run by LHH, so I'm a graduate, lived experience, and a guest speaker in that space. I'm joined today by Mida. Mida's also just on camera for while we say hello to you. Mida is, hi Mida. Mida is producing for us today, and that means that she will be brilliantly running our polls and facilitating any Q&As. I am mindful, therefore, that we'll invite you to comment through chat, through Q&A. The nature of this session is I'm largely going to talk at you for quite a bit of it and then hold space at the end to bring to life those Q&As. But bearing in mind that the whole purpose of this is very much about learning communities, I invite you to comment and for each other to comment, sharing any reflections you have, any observations you have, because that can benefit others. If there are questions very specifically for myself, we'll obviously do our best to pick those up, but they may be held to the end just because of the nature of how we'll run through this. So, Mida, thank you very much for your support today. Everybody, I'm going to get us kicked off. So the aim of the session, therefore, is to take you through what we see as some of the considerations that enable women to thrive in the workplace, considerations for building sustainable pipelines, and also actually some reassurance that the headwinds and self-limiting beliefs that women do hold are developable. So the aim very much to just give you some thinking and reflection time for you. You may be here as a woman yourself or very much as an ally or enabler of women in leadership. Also very keen that you do have some actionable directions, some takeaways from today's session. So let me just start with this beautiful quote. And in fact, let me just give my own reflection around this. Does anyone else struggle with the concept that Pluto may no longer be a planet? And I say that because one of my own reflections is I love learning and I like to think of myself as having a growth mindset, but I'm not okay with the concept that Pluto may not be a planet. You can tell me there's a new planet and I can take that on board as new information, new learning, that's fine. But invite me to unlearn that. I didn't even know it was a long-held belief until I'm challenged in that way. And it's your useful reflection on mindset. And I invite you all to kind of think in this way as well, where, you know, this is a room full of incredible, amazing professionals, probably lots of incredible knowledge and experience, expertise that you feel pretty good about. And as a result, we've probably got strong beliefs and opinions because of how we've developed. And I just kind of consider this, that in a stable world, that makes a lot of sense, but we're living in this rapidly changing world, and we have been for some time. And I'm just going to step us back before fully leaning into women in leadership to acknowledge VUCA and BANI worlds. And when I've talked to this before, I think we've got varying awareness of this, but VUCA is really an acronym for how we were describing the kind of, as we turned into the millennium, the world of work in which we were living in terms of this sort of increased globalization and digitization. And VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And, you know, I won't lie, I was just starting to get my head around talking to that as this world of work and how this impacts leadership development and our thinking. And we've moved to BANI. BANI being brittle and anxious, non-linear and incomprehensible, which I think is particularly interesting because BANI is really talking to our world more in this pandemic era and in our age of sort of artificial intelligence, generative AI, etc. And I think it's important to remember actually that our own mental pliability has been stretched in ways that we probably didn't think could have imagined. So, you know, forgive the sensitivity here, but did we ever think that we couldn't hug parent or a grandparent? You know, the pandemic really did kind of create this new world, and technology and the pace at which this is now accelerating is really why we lean into this banny language a bit more and kind of saying VUCA was actually, that was built for a world when smartphones were entering the world. I don't know if anybody else made the session on Monday. I co-hosted with my colleague Tong. He's a data scientist, and we were talking about this AI and generative AI, and the aim being very much to give our HR colleagues the opportunity to feel more confident in asking questions. And one of the kind of real takeaways for me was this piece around mindset and our ability to keep thinking and rethinking and being very open in that. And I still think that holds dear when we lean into women in leadership as well, because the reality of it is that women in leadership, well, women and gender and where we're at this point in time is societal. It's not just something that's specific to your organization or to any one woman. And the mindsets and beliefs, they may not be conscious in us as women or in our allies, and those are enabling practices for women to thrive in the workplace. So that's why I kind of give that context, because sometimes I think we can be quite hard on ourselves as HR professionals, let alone as any women in the room, about how the progress we're making in this space. And so I do start with this lovely quote: "Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." So just on a little bit of the business case stuff very, very quickly, because the reality of it is you are all perfectly apt at putting your fingers out there onto the internet and finding any information you want that validates women make a difference to the bottom line. There is so much research out there, and again, with the ChatGPT, with artificial intelligence, you can find it quicker than ever to create a business case around this. So it's probably not my job to do this for you in the same way, but let me just acknowledge organizations with at least 30% women in leadership roles are 12 times more likely to be in the top 20% for financial performance. Just a quote, a numerical output for consideration. But what I want to talk to is broadening that piece and thinking about this world that we're living in and why women, and women particularly thriving in the workplace, is so important for us. So let me just start by acknowledging environmental social governance, ESG, which is increasingly a boardroom staple. And within this, there's obviously regulatory requirements. And I just want to acknowledge gender pay gap reporting as one area. It's been in place since 2017 for us here in the UK. And I really had to think back and go, gosh, that's nearly 7 years ago. I remember sitting in an employment law briefing where this suggestion was, don't worry too much, as long as you've got a narrative. And I guess the reality of it is having a narrative is no longer really enough. We really need to be evidencing outputs around this and really thinking about, therefore, sustainable women in leadership impact. And of course, we are hearing the government leaning into how else this might be reported, because it's not been having the impact wanted. In terms of ESG, other considerations, influencers, the social piece, you know, our consumers, our buyers of our services or our products, they are so much more socially conscious. And to anybody out there with a teenage daughter, you may have come across the example of White Fox, which is a clothing brand, Australian clothing brand, where the CEO had published this incredible image in the summer of all these products ready to go, bags full, ready to be posted. And the backlash was, look at all that plastic. Look at the environmental impact of all this postage. And actually what she was really trying to do was celebrate everything that they were achieving and from a performance perspective. But it then is impacted in terms of wearing that brand's associated with environmentally negative impact. So I guess that's where I kind of frame up thinking about the context in which we're all kind of leading through. EDI maturity itself, so this marketplace, what I would say here is, you know, it wasn't that long ago that we were trying to start with diversity, and we're definitely seeing a shift now more to leaning into how do we start with inclusion to get to diversity. So that definitely feels like a much bigger kind of association and narrative for EDI strategies. And certainly, you know, as an example, recruiting senior women, that might pinpoint a short-term diversity metric, but there's not necessarily any succession in the EDI space behind that. And in fact, it actually highlights even more in a time of talent scarcity, a real risk, because it was just last year, in the UK data, 2022 was showing that for every new director level woman appointed, 2 senior women exited. So there is a critical problem there. And obviously that's not just about what's happening at the top of the tree, if you like, at the top of the organization. That is visible to those who would be aspiring to potentially being senior leaders and thinking about the impact through the business in that. But certainly we know that diverse talent is critical to staying agile and building our kind of more kind of collective ability to think around the next corner is probably the best way of putting that. And then just finally, just another consideration is the skill demands themselves and how these are shifting. So, you know, we are hearing much more about compassionate wisdoms or human-centric leadership. What does that actually mean then in terms of the skills that are in demand? And there's some incredible research that shows that women outperform men on 17 of the most 19 in-demand skills in 2023. So there's lots of research saying that women are holding some real natural abilities or capability for the skills that are in demand today. So whilst we might be developing towards these in-demand skills as organizations, we may actually have talent pools that have naturally got these in a more abundance. And actually, further just on this is actually a Deco Group research about the future of work. And yes, it talks a little bit to AI, but the context here that I really want to lean into are these points about the least replaceable human skills in an age of artificial intelligence. And these skills are very much correlated to those in-demand skills that I was talking about. So emotional intelligence, empathy, active listening, interpersonal skills. These are the ones that are actually probably being coined our most resilient of skills. And I guess if we're thinking kind of more broadly, the exciting thing here is that that's really feeding a wonderful kind of learning culture mindset, that, you know, whether women are your sort of primary kind of skill space for this currently, or whether it's more developing culturally towards this, it's quite an exciting era. Now, let me lean in a little bit here. We, as a leadership business, obviously we focus on this piece around future world of work. So we get to prioritize what do we think are the key trends. So we're obviously doing an abundance of research on a regular basis so that, let's be honest, commercially, we're knowing where to lean and where we're going to have most value, and critically, how we can better support our client organization. And actually, women in leadership as a topic, it isn't new to LHH. We first leaned into this and did a huge global piece of research in 2016, 2017. But really, I would say since 2019, it really has accelerated for us as a business. But it allows us, that research was quite foundational for us to really think about, well, how do we support our client organizations when we're talking about creating conditions for success for women in leadership? And the construct really is just built around these 3 principles. And to some extent, this really sets the tone of how I'm going to share our thinking with you today. Culture, number 1, culture. So we were asking questions about what culture initiatives were important, what leadership behaviors in particular distinguish the sort of champions of women talent. So we might use allyship as a language now. Secondly, organizational practices themselves. So what are the policies, the guiding principles, the programs that really impacted for women feeling like they can thrive or be successful in the workplace? And then the individual behaviors of women. So what are the mindset and behaviors that distinguish women who are elevating their careers, but also what were the headwinds? So I'm just going to start this by leaning in a little bit to sharing some of the research that came out in 2016. So having a look at this is the culture construct piece first. Bearing in mind 2016, these were the top 4 initiatives that came out strongly. I'll quickly read these for you. The organization is known as a good place to work for women. Leaders create equal opportunity and a consistent experience for all employees. The organisation recognises and leverages senior women leaders as role models, and leaders are committed to gender diversity. Well, yeah, that's all pretty foundational, but interestingly, I would now, and let's not forget, it's been a few years, question a couple of these. So for example, our second one here, it refers to leaders create equal opportunity. Well, actually, I'm sure most of us know that International Women's Day this year was very much about equity, not equality. So helping us understand that there's a difference there and that equity is about leveling the playing field. And I'll go on to talk about that a little bit more for us. The third point here is interesting as well about role models in senior women. And that's great if you've got women role models who really kind of advocate for the behaviors that you do want to celebrate. But it depends, you know, kind of how successfully and sustainably we've managed to get our senior women leaders in there. Are they genuinely kind of role models that we believe will feed succession? And that is a question that I pose. Or has it been a diversity metric fix? Or is it too much of a burden that we ask? You know, it's already a lot to be a woman leader at the moment. We do acknowledge these things. So are we placing a lot of pressure on that? My point being that it's okay to keep challenging these. And actually, it's the next 4 points down in 2016 that I have observed are more important now. And I just want to share these with you. So the next 4 culture initiatives, if you like, committed advocacy. So the sponsorship of women talent. I would agree that's critical now. An organisation that clearly communicates the business reasons for advancing women. So not just doing it, I would say, externally, but internally communicating, this is why we do this. And successful organizations understand the social, economic, and organizational benefits. So a little bit of that kind of world of work context I shared with you. And that they communicate that having the most diverse and inclusive environments is core to executing on strategy. So very much linking women in leadership, not as a, oh, it feels like this is something we should be doing, which might be the kind of stick piece, but very much about it's the carrot, we're leading with this. And just really leaning into this piece about culture. The reality of it is leaders shape cultures. Culture, I love this concept that culture is derived from the repeated behavior that becomes a habit over time. I think it was Adam Grant that talks to the fact that, you know, adaptive organizations, there's not really such a thing. It's the adaptive human behaviors, because adaptation is a human behavior. And it's that collective thing that either allows organizations to adapt or nosedive in performance because they failed to adapt. And it's just an interesting concept about how we think about reminding ourselves that our organizations are a collective behavior of leaders. So this piece around leadership and culture, leaders have a huge role to play in terms of supporting women leaderships, or women in leadership, my apologies. I love the fact that, you know, my observation around sort of allyship and leaning into supporting environments that women lead in and thrive in is that most people are willing. So willingness isn't a problem. Most of us really want to support that. You know, if you've got men leaders, they may have wives, daughters, they have mothers. It's not a lack of willingness. And even if we intellectually understand the business rationale, it's just this fact that we rise to the levels of our daily interactions. We're busy and it can be really difficult to unlearn habits. And which is why I love this concept that culture is derived from repeated behavior that becomes a habit over time. I just want to maybe open up, Mida, if it's okay, to a first poll, because I have talked at you now for a little bit and I would love to get a little bit of input on this. So Mida, could I invite you to host the poll? She's off and running. It's a busy poll. That is because the question we are asking is, what do you believe are the most important behaviours for allyship on a gender basis at work? So i.e. the champions of women talent could be another way of putting that. What do you believe are the most important behaviours? And if you could select 3, There's no right or wrong answer to this, because we've actually run some research, and I'm really interested in kind of get a sense test of how that fits for yourselves. So thank you to those who are contributing at the moment. Thank you. We're starting to see some quite interesting trends here. And shifting a bit, so thank you for your ongoing contributions. I appreciate I've asked you to select up to threes, which creates a bit of variation to how we're doing this. Okay. Mira, would you say we're sort of settling down in terms of the poll? Oh, still going a little bit.
I think we're nearly settling down.
Okay. Thank you, Mira. If we just share our results, and my apologies if I cut anybody off mid-flow while you were reflecting and thinking on that.
They should be sharing now.
Okay. So it's interesting that this flexibility piece remains important, but I love the fact that the exposure and profile to senior leaders, which is a little bit like a link to that advocacy piece, has come out really important to you, because I agree. I'm seeing this as an increasing trend. And in fact, there's some lovely topical sessions that you can lean into at the moment around, you know, one of the things that we've invited women to do over the last sort of 5 years in particular is advocate for themselves. And actually one of the, you know, because that's something we typically women don't do as well as men. But interestingly, there's a real school of thought that says, you know, amongst everything else, perhaps the greatest gift is actually this advocacy from mentors and sponsors within the business and facilitating networks. So some great input there. Please feel free to comment. Sorry, Mida, I've just closed that for us. Please feel free to comment in the chat if you want to keep any discussion sort of moving along in that space. But I just want to share our sort of thoughts on this allyship piece and supporting allyship critically, because it absolutely is a catalyst for advancing women in terms of allies being champions of women leaders, and very much in the sustainable place as well, as opposed to the sort of one and done. So just a couple of things I wanted to share with you on this. Bring this through for you. So in terms of supporting allyship, certainly we really believe in advocating for very senior level sponsorship here, in terms of, now, this isn't just about a senior sponsor being a one-to-one ally of a particular woman leader, but more as a concept of, you know, talking about it, asking for updates, making it very much part of the dialogue around how are we doing as a business. So internal executive sponsorship. And I mean that as well, because sometimes what we're very good at as organizations is externally saying all the right things, but not necessarily leaning in internally through that. In addition, the reality of what I was just saying before is there is always a willingness. I have no sort of qualms about a lack of willingness for people to be allies. I just think sometimes with a busy world, it's really difficult to fit in and change a behavior or adapt your own behavior to be an ally. So it's a really good idea to be thinking about, well, can we do some more formal development? If we're running leadership development, or if we're running development programs for women, can we do more to advocate for this piece around allyship? And that might be distinguishing between sponsorship, mentoring, and coaching conversations, because those three things are all very different and require slightly different skill sets, and you might actually have different audiences for those as well. So I think that's a really important consideration for us. In regard to that, I am absolutely a huge advocate then for the visibility and recognition of allyship. So one of the biggest things, and if we're going to lean into sustainability, this one's critical. If we have people leaders who are celebrating their women talent, who are putting forward women talent, who are giving them stretch projects, how are we recognizing that? How are we talking about it? Because that's the piece that really helps sustain behavior, as opposed to it being perhaps a one and done. Because let's be fair, in our banny world, we don't know at what point we're suddenly going to be tipping into another sort of chaos, which means sustaining some of these behaviors are harder. So I think having practices around the visibility of congratulating that work of allies is really important. And linked to that, awareness raising before, so if you're doing any talent program, talent forum meetings, you're looking at your succession, etc., why not give people leaders the opportunity to better understand some of the headwinds faced by minority talent? So gender here, we're leaning into gender, but not exclusively. But why not get them to think a little bit more about the fact that perhaps from a gender perspective or other minority talent, sometimes the capability isn't always as visible, or it's not as we've always seen it or understood it to be displayed. And linked to that, when we host women in leadership development programs ourselves, we bake in development for people leaders. It's not an option not to do this, if that makes sense. So we can make this a lighter touch or a more engaged piece of work, but we will always, as a minimum, insist that all people leaders of women who are going on development programs, because again, this is key to the conditions for thriving, are given the opportunity to better understand some of the insights from our research. So what are the headwinds, and validating that with some data, and giving them the opportunity to really think about, well, how can I better champion women talent, etc. And that genuinely makes a huge difference to the impact of, if you're going to do something to develop women, to develop the people leaders as well. And I am going to move through into our organisational practices to that was a bit of a probably moving through out of the piece on culture and I guess allyship. But just sort of checking in, are we able to host another call about organisational practices as I transition through into that?
Yes, of course. Also, Sinead, you've got a bit of an echo. It might be worth maybe muting and then coming off mute and see if that helps. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I apologise to everyone. Okay, thank you for that, Mida. I'm in a very quiet office environment. We might be a little bit more sterile. Is that any better?
No, it's still echoing.
Okay, I'll mute myself again while we're going through this and just have a quick look. You can see the question in front of you, so I'll let you self-discipline through that. Thank you to everybody who's participating through this in terms of, and apologies, I didn't read it out, so you are having to read the screen, but it's about the organisational practices which you have that you really believe in. Because I think sometimes we have organisational practices that they've just been there for a while. And it's really leaning into what do we really think works. Thank you again for your participation in this. Some very strong views about flexible working coming through, but also interestingly around menopause. I think that's very congratulatory to the movement that we're experiencing this year. Mida, could I invite you to conclude the poll for me?
Yes, I'm just sharing the results now.
Thank you, Mida. Thank you. So flexible working, and it's been a really interesting one. Flexible working itself has experienced some real challenges this year, and as we've been trying to kind of re-educate around what has hybrid done for, hybrid and flexible working aren't necessarily the same thing, but there's been some really interesting debates this year about has hybrid created more risk of burnout in women, etc. And I think it's really important we just keep listening in this space. It's really about visibility and the fact that our work and home lives are so much more enmeshed. There's no one right answer to this. It'll be about what's right in your organizational culture at this point in time. I think flexible working is critical from a women in leadership perspective. And I think it would be pretty ill-fated to not have a focus on this if you're trying to attract women talent or retain women talent. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Mida. I'm just going to lean into organizational practices here. This very much reflects what you were just sharing. So the quote here on flexible working, 49% of women leaders say flexibility is one of the top 3 things they consider when deciding whether to join or stay, so attraction or retention, compared with 34% of men leaders. So it is, as is often the case, there is data to support that. It's just that you will hear quite a bit of narrative at the moment around this debate about the impact, particularly as we lean into burnout, which is in this bottom quadrant here referred to as ill-being. So women leaders consistently do a lot more around well-being for their teams, etc., but are more prone to burnout. And there was considerable research from McKinsey backing that up as well. Mothers, in addition, so women mothers are 23% more prone to burnout than the fathers. So there is a lot here around why organizational practices are going to be important. I think increasingly things like fertility, women's health, pregnancy, baby loss, these have increasingly become important, but we mustn't lose sight of things like paternity practices, etc., because it all sends a very, very powerful and visible message around, are we enabling? Do we believe this is important? And this is, I guess, why for us, this feels really important to honour this space and keep focusing on it. I've certainly seen that ERGs or network groups are a really good way to test these and kind of understand, do we need to lean into any of this any further? So I think just keep looking at it. I wanted to bring to life a couple of these for you, just leaning into a couple before I take you through the individual behaviours. And the first one I wanted to highlight today is around the motherhood tax or the motherhood penalty. And I'm hoping the concept's not completely new to you, because it was this year that the Nobel Prize winner, in fact, you may have kind of covered picked up on some of this from a women in leadership perspective. But Claudia Goldin illustrated that whilst the gender pay gap used to be linked directly to sort of education and occupational segregation, it's now largely due to the motherhood penalty. So and I'm hoping that to some extent this quote kind of says what it is, but what I just wanted to highlight is that, when I've touched on this, what's been interesting is that it even starts before pregnancy, or whether or not you're going to be pregnant. As a young woman in the workforce, so from an early careers perspective, there can be this anticipation of child rearing years to come. And then, of course, the complexities that follow this.
Sinead,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. There is still an echo. A lot of participants are here. I'm so sorry.
No, okay. Mida, would you be okay if I sort of dropped connection and tried to reconnect? Because I'm not quite sure how best to support everyone with that.
Yeah, that might be the best. Apologies.
No, of course. How about I'll stop my video and stop sharing, yeah?
Yeah, that's
And
no.
see if I can reconnect everybody. So please hang in there. We'll reconnect with you. If we could play music, we would. Hello everyone, I'll try again. My apologies if the connection isn't holding properly for some reason. Mida, is it still?
It's still echoing.
Okay, okay. One of the things, if this continues to be a problem, one of the things we will do is record this on a separate occasion and send it to you, because I'm not sure I have a solution for it, Mida. I don't know if you've got any other ideas.
Do you have separate speakers to the computer?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
The only thing I think it would be is if the speakers were too close to the microphone, but that can't.
No, okay.
And the volume on your computer down, it might be a feedback.
Of course, thank you.
But yeah, sorry, I can't.
No, it's okay. We will keep trying.
Thank you.
How does that sound? Any better? Still echoing?
It's still echoing a bit.
Gosh, okay, everybody. I do sincerely apologize. I think this is the first sort of technical challenge that we've had in this regard. Obviously, I don't know quite how bad this is for everybody. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm in an office today. If this continues to bad, my preference would be to probably honour your time by stopping delivering this live and providing you with a recorded version of it, because it would be no trouble to share a recorded version. What we will lose is any interaction from yourselves in terms of Q&A, and I am mindful of that.
Everyone in the chat
but it may be a best alternative if the audio is poor.
Everyone in the chat is saying that they can tolerate it and are happy for you to carry on.
Okay, well, that's very gracious of you all, but we may actually do a recording in addition. I will continue, and I am very grateful for your support. But Mida, if we feel like we need to adjust it, just let me know again.
I will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I touched on the motherhood penalty. Interestingly, menopause came up as a key subject, and I'm very grateful that it has. We are living in an era where we are able to talk to this much more than we ever were in the past, and I do hope that more and more of you have got guiding principles for employees and people managers around menopause now. Certainly, the reason for acknowledging this isn't just because it's the right thing to do, but because it is much more business critical than it ever has been. Women over 50 are our fastest growing demographic in the workplace. And whilst I am being a little bit general here with the age profile of menopause, perimenopause typically is from 45, and there obviously are exceptions, and it will get younger year on year typically as well. But therefore, we have a really key audience and a real vital kind of talent pool that it will be experiencing menopause in the workplace. And the government itself has recognised that, and just this year appointed its first employee champion, Helen Tomlinson, to provide guidance, not only into the government, but for the workplace. So this is increasingly topical, and certainly I've seen it was well covered at CIPD, etc. last week as well. What I do want to acknowledge in this space is, there is a lot of data around this, and currently, though, it is based on the data that comes forward, and I suspect the statistics are much higher than they actually are, but 1 in 4 women have considered leaving their jobs due to menopause symptoms. Of the 10% of women who have left their jobs due to menopause symptoms, 98% of these are due to psychological symptoms. And it's that particular one I just want to lean into a little bit, because psychological symptoms will actually, some of the challenges for women is that we do face kind of challenges around self-limiting beliefs, imposter syndrome. It is more prevalent, and the research all shows this up. So if you then layer on menopause symptoms that are often linked to insomnia, brain fog, anxiety, those can be so much more prevalent and need a lot more work than they ever did before. So it is a critical challenge. ERGs, now the employee resource groups, we actually ran a session on this morning. Just because of the time I've used up, I'm not going to lean into this particularly, but what I would say is this is a beautiful avenue that, whilst led from an HR structure in terms of how it links maybe to EDI strategy or kind of overall talent strategy, this is a wonderful space to be actually allowing employees to drive a lot of awareness raising. So whether that's through inclusion brunches or food for thought concepts, or feeding back into the business around maybe new guiding principles, etc. But certainly this space can really raise awareness. So things like menopause awareness or the motherhood tax, we've run sessions on that, not just aimed at women, but at allyship pieces as well. So these can be incredibly effective and a very useful kind of time efficiency from an HR perspective. As I start to lean in more towards individual behaviours, I did acknowledge, and I'm sure some of you have seen this slide before. I think it was particularly well used this year at International Women's Day, the difference between equality and equity. And when we look at women in leadership development programs, it's really important that the aim here is about levelling the playing field. It's not instead of other leadership development programs. It's about acknowledging that to level the playing field, we need to support women in particular with some of the headwinds they do face before or alongside attending broader leadership development programs. And just a quick consideration, in terms of women in leadership as a concept, we talk to leaders being leaders at all levels, so women leaders at all levels, whether that is early career, more like MEDA, and the challenges from an early career perspective may be that actually they're very influenced by what they see at the top of the organisation, but also what they experience can create barriers further down the career journey. Equally, junior management, that first line manager step, real critical problem that McKinsey highlighted, they called it the broken rung. Women can really race through their first kind of 10 years career on the premise that they may or may not have children, but it's kind of hanging there and want to get ahead and be more at risk of burnout. But actually, the evidence is showing that more men are still promoted at that first stage. So we do have a problem with early career or certainly first line management levels. Mid-leaders, so I would say this is where we've seen most investment from a women in leadership perspective, and I think that's because this is often a critical kind of stuck middle. Either there isn't the talent viewed as succession for senior leadership, or there's this sort of sense that we're not maybe making the most of the talent we've got here, or it's the post potentially return to work era, etc. But critically, all the way through to senior women, where we know we're not necessarily retaining senior women in the way that we should, and right through to later careers. And by that, I mean, let's stop thinking about later careers being really good administrators and really thinking about how can we reskill? How can we really think differently about our end-to-end talent cycle that makes it more inspirational for women to want to stay and add value in different ways? not just influencing, but shaping the business. The thing here is you probably can't do everything at once, but I think it's really important to know your starting point, or depending on the maturity, know where you're next going to go. And it's useful to think about it in these sort of buckets, because the intervention levels, particularly from development programs, do look different and should look different for these audiences. As we lean into women in leadership, and I was just going to run a poll, but I think, Mira, I'm just going to keep going a little bit here because of our time loss.
Okay.
When I referred to the research we did, so I just want to share with you that we did pull through some really clear research around what are the behaviours of women who excel. So these were the common behaviours that were seen, but also what are the headwinds that are faced by women? What is it that holds women back? And then using that construct to help us better understand what might an individual development programme be constructed with. What are the key component points? So that's how LHH approached looking at developing a women in leadership programme. And therefore, to keep it really kind of simple, there are kind of 4 key philosophies around career activism, strengthening confidence and resilience, leading with personal impact, and raising strategic value. So that's kind of your core kind of content component areas that I think are really important. And I think if you're leaning into individual development programs or development programs for women, one of the spaces that often gets missed is actually career activism. And it's the connectivity across all of these that's really important. I love this quote about women need a space to be heard without masculine energy. Critically, there is this kind of comes back to why you would do women-only programs. But let me just very quickly bring to life a little bit about the programme areas that I see working really well. Bearing in mind, I've been a participant, I've been a guest speaker, I'm very close to kind of what we see working. And it's the term career activism that I want to really pull through here, differentiating from career planning. Women are really good at kind of reflecting on their careers, you know, maybe looking at their drivers, their motivators. There's no real gender difference in that space. The difference is very much in this piece around activism. So do you have a clear shared career plan? Men are typically better at sharing their career goals and their plans and what's next, and thinking about how that connects to the next again. And I say this very much as a bit of an insight, because this quote here is really simple. In a busy, busy world, it's not that people aren't willing. It's just I help those who I see helping themselves. That's just a really normal human behavior in a really, really busy world with competing demands. And I think if women are sort of dropping under the radar, it's not because they're not thinking about it. It's maybe because they're not articulating it. And that's one of the things that development programs can really help women explore and better understand. Another area that's super important is this confidence and resilience. I think we can probably all lean into this as HR professionals as well at this time of year, to the end of November. But within the development programs, we're really big advocates on the mindset piece. So focus on strength. So we utilise things like strength scope, as opposed to necessarily utilising insights that get us pulled into the weeds of thinking about development. And women, more so than men, will go into the weeds of the development areas as opposed to building on strength. So that's one of the mindset things that we think about when we're looking at women in leadership programs. Understanding boundaries is really important. We've talked about this flexible working, hybrid working, acknowledging that therefore what are our boundaries and how have they shifted in your career tenure, and how, you know, if you think about the life stages we go through, our boundaries will shift and change, and how are those being managed. And one of the great things is bringing a community of women together who can share different lived experiences of what's working, what's not working, and really kind of hold that space. Even down to, you know, let's acknowledge women do carry more emotional labour. So how is that managed when we turn up to work already feeling like you've run a million miles? People pleasers, women, it has been proven, are more prone to people pleasing than men. So again, this can carry greater exhaustion and distraction from our kind of core priorities. And what can be quite useful is to provide some of the data that sits behind this as content within programs, to really give resonance to why it's important to lean into this and think about how do I better manage this. Another thing, focus on energy, not just how you maximize time. I can tell you now, the minute you go into this sort of confidence and resilience space and you're talking about boundaries, being effective with your time, etc., how do I get more out of my day is a really common mindset that we're faced with. And actually, it can be a lot. The reframe is very much about, well, actually, how do I focus on where I'm getting my best energy? And the self-compassion piece is huge. And I would say this is one of the most wonderful places with a cohort of women who feel psychologically safe in order to be vulnerable. This piece can be really quite powerful, and acknowledging that, you know, life happens and it's not just about what happens at work, particularly, as I said, in our kind of hybrid worlds these days. And I think just I show this image intentionally because actually I've seen this linked to women in leadership development programs. Wow, a wrecking ball. It's like, how bulletproof does a woman have to be? Is almost this concept of resilience isn't actually about immunity to pain. And I think sometimes the superhero that's prone within women is the ability to, oh, I'll cope with more, I can cope with more. And actually, again, this thing about how do we reframe is a really important space that gets explored. One of the other subject areas, impact and brand, absolutely huge. And you've got to kind of think about what I was just saying about, you know, kind of all of these sort of exhaustions that we can be more prone to. One of the really kind of common things, and you'll hear it perhaps in yourself or in others, is when we open our meetings and say, how are you? I'm busy. How are you? And the thing is, that's very real, especially if you've had a busy morning before you even started work. And that kind of, you're in that hamster wheel. Or, you know, it's considering then, well, how's that landing? How are people perceiving me? Because I'm spending a lot of time being busy, not necessarily articulating in a different way. So we can get wrapped up with how you get perceived. And, you know, the reality is perception is reality. So that's a big part of what we look into. I'm just going to acknowledge quickly here as well, strategic value. So the research showed that women are perceived as less strategic. Women are, there's no difference in capability, by the way. That's not what it is. It's the difference is perception. And that's a real challenge. And a lot of this is in the behaviors of women being more prone to undertake grunt work. Sure, I'll do that. I'll pick it up. I'm a people pleaser. I can finish that for you. Really hard to say no as well. So societally, this comes from a lot of family environment. It's not something that's just specific to a woman in a workplace. And therefore can be drowning in execution, because there's a lot of pride attached to how well have I produced something, how well have I delivered something. Women are also great multitaskers, that's been proven, but also prone to over multitasking. And really, we explore some of the risks associated with that, because we can have women come into our development programs proud of being multitaskers, and sometimes we have to kind of reset the risk around that. One of the fascinating things that I think has come up in our development programs is because it's not a capability piece around strategic, how you're perceived in terms of strategic value, it's a perception piece. It's thinking about the language that women are more prone to utilising than men. And this is a really powerful space. So the difference between utilising terms like, in my opinion, versus my point of view is. One is almost a little bit more apologetic, and again, typically comes from family and societal backgrounds, whereas that's sort of pleasing, in my opinion. It's not offensive, I'm not forcing it, you can take it or leave it, in my opinion. And women are more prone to this compared to men who can be quite comfortable saying, my point of view is, and being quite solid with that and impactful. So you will see here that as a result, you know, one of the things that you will hear women also say is, does that make sense? And again, you know, again, reflect on yourself. How often do you finish a sentence very politely with, well, I didn't, you know, just make sure everyone's okay with that. Does that make sense, what I've said? And all of that downplays strategic impact. And this is about perception. So as you can imagine, this is a really interesting space for us all to be exploring, and isn't just resonant to women at the most senior levels. Because of time, I'm not going to particularly drop into a little bit more about how we structure our development programs. I think if you're interested in the development program piece, the bit about addressing individual behaviours, we actually host taster sessions, and the next ones will be in February, and they're complimentary taster sessions. Some of you might have been on these before. We typically run them every year, give them the opportunity to maybe immerse into these sort of subject areas a little bit more and get a feel for the kind of different ways that we construct this to have greatest impact. And the impact is super important. They do work. So we measure pre and post. What are the behaviours? How are women self-rating themselves going into a programme around these behaviours? And at the end of it, and the number one behavioural shift across all our programmes is this piece here about holding yourself back from applying for more senior roles because you worry about the impact on your time and well-being. It's not necessarily a worry about my capability. So that's really, really powerful, that talent is being held back for these other reasons. You can see there's more in here, and I'd love to take you through more time on this, but I am conscious that I am talking potentially still with an echo, and we are rapidly coming towards the close of the hour. But I just wanted to say to you, running women in leadership development programs, do look at their impact beyond promotion, beyond lateral job moves, but we have all that data and it does drive it, but they may not be your only reasons for having women in leadership programs. And understanding these behavioural shifts is a really great way of validating them as well. So I am mindful that this may not have been your smoothest listening experience ever, but therefore what I want to do is just give you a little bit of time to Q&A, very short couple of minutes, if there is anything that we can support with, Mida.
Hello. We've not got any questions in the Q&A yet, but there were a lot of people asking for the research on women outperforming men. Can I just check, is that the Harvard Business School research?
So the quote earlier through, yes, there's the HBR and there's McKinsey. Yeah, I think it's probably the HBR one that they're referring to, yeah.
Okay, lovely. I can put the link for that in the chat.
Thank you, Mida.
I've got a Q&A. How would you measure the behavioural shifts from a programme? I think it says.
Yeah. Well, those behaviour shifts are directly linked to the research, and in a way for us, it validates that we are utilising the right content in development programmes when we run them. But they are linked to the research we originally did around the behaviours of excelling women and the headwinds. It's a self-rating scale that we do. So this is a minimum kind of level of self-rating in start of programme, 6 months-ish later, post-programme, and then validating another 6 months down the line. You can obviously expand that out to include 180, 360 tools as well, which we do on some programs, but the minimum that is baked in, and it does, from a self perspective, self-rating, give that insight.
Thank you. Someone has put, do you have any more information about how to run an ERG?
Oh gosh, absolutely. But I think probably the best thing is Sam's session from earlier today, Mida. That'll have been recorded, won't it? And that was specifically on how, not just how to run an EDI, but more ERG, how to link it to EDI strategy, how to use data from your engagement surveys, your gender and ethnicity pay gap reporting to inform priority areas. So my apologies if I sort of whistled through that one a little bit, but certainly I can share with you some of the topics we've run. Just as a very quick one, we've got a strategy day next week looking at it, but we will look at the calendar of national and international dates because they exist, and that allows us then to prioritise particular forums such as Gender Forum, which typically covers our women's agenda. But it could also be the intersectionality with mental health, so of potential neurodiversity forum, or ethnicity as well. But it basically allows us to create a calendar of events, and that we tie the themes in linked to what's coming through from our engagement surveys, and obviously hold a review every year to look at where do we think the gaps are as well. So for example, I would also share that World Menopause Day last month, because we're more mature as a business in that space, we decided to look at it through an ethnicity lens because it was also Black History Month, and that was really powerful for us as a business because when we leaned in, we realised that our wonderful menopause movement is very white middle class talent like me kind of led through the likes of Davina McCall, etc. And there was a little bit more science mistrust for our ethnicity community, for South Asian women and Black women in particular. So it was very powerful.
Thank you. I've got someone asking, please, can you go back to the slide saying that women should stop saying, does that make sense?
Women should.
I think it's 2 slides back, 3 slides.
Some of this?
Yeah.
In terms of the strategic value piece?
Yeah.
I particularly like this one because there are, and again, we're happy to share the researches, but there are, without doubt, there are headwinds that women face. There are behaviours that are more prone in women because societally we will be brought up in particular ways as well, and this continues to be reinforced. That's my kind of positioning around mindset and culture. But I don't know if there's any particular questions around this. But as you can imagine, it's not necessarily directly linked to somebody's about to move to a strategic role. There's lots of reasons why you would be thinking about this earlier career as well, but it is more prevalent, I would say, as a content area from mid-level onwards in our programmes.